Hey y'all, welcome back to another book review video. I know it's been a while since my last one, but that's because I was reading quite a long book, which we will be discussing today, and that is The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This is also going to be the first time I do a book review video that is completely devoid of spoilers. If I'm being honest, that's mostly because this book is so long and so complicated that I don't feel like trying to do a plot synopsis or like a deep analysis of it. I just think that it will be easier and also more enjoyable for me to share my general opinions rather than very specific opinions in this case. So yeah, no spoilers today, which I mean, I'm sure that'll be good for some people. I also have to give my typical disclaimers. This is just my opinion, so if you guys disagree, that's totally cool, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Also, as per usual here on this channel, my little cat is actually already here, and she gets really excited every time she hears me talking a lot. So if you hear or see her, or if she hits my tripod, I'm sorry, and I hope it's not too distracting, but she likes it when I talk. I don't know. But those should be all of the disclaimers out of the way, so let's go ahead and get started. This is probably the biggest thing that I want to talk about when it comes to Priory of the Orange Tree, because the complexity really colored the way that I read this novel. Starting out, there are so many names and places and bits of lore that the reader has to become accustomed to. It's not a story that's set on Earth, but rather a completely new fantasy setting, so there's a lot to get used to. And I've talked about this before on my channel, that I think that it can be complicated to introduce readers to a brand new fantasy world without it being immediately overwhelming. And for a while, I definitely thought that Priory of the Orange Tree was going to be a little bit too overwhelming. I was really struggling through the first couple of chapters trying to remember who was who and where I was and what the relationships were between all these different countries that are in the book. Thankfully, though, it didn't last long. I really did think that I was going to have to reread this book at least one more time to fully immerse myself, but I was completely wrong. I can't say exactly when it started to shift for me, but after struggling through the first few chapters, suddenly I realized that I knew who the characters were, and I knew who they were talking to and who they were related to and what country they were from. The lore just absolutely clicked for me, which was a huge relief again, because I was a little bit nervous about that. And obviously that's a pretty personal thing, and I'm sure that it varies greatly from person to person. But based on my experience, I thought that this was actually a huge testament to Shannon's writing capabilities, because with the new fantasy setting, it does make sense that at first there's going to be a little bit of confusion as you adjust to this new world. But the fact that I was able to quite early on and with absolutely no pain transition from being really confused to completely understanding it, I feel like that speaks volumes to her capabilities. In terms of complexity, The Priory of the Orange Tree has been compared to Game of Thrones, mostly because they share a similar narrative style. Game of Thrones takes you through the story via many different viewpoints and different places, and Priory of the Orange Tree is exactly the same in that regard. One chapter will be told from the perspective of Ede, the next from Tane, and then the next from Nicolaes, and so on and so forth. Though this technically does add to the complexity of the novel because you are following many different characters in many different places, I really do think that it's actually beneficial because it is such a vast fantasy world that having a ton of different characters that you get to follow along with really helps flesh it out and make it make more sense in the end. So yeah, Game of Thrones and Priory of the Orange Tree, very similar in that way, but there is a big way that they are extremely dissimilar. Before anyone gets upset, I promise that I am not saying that the entirety of this novel was super predictable. There are plenty of times that Priory of the Orange Tree surprised me, that I gasped aloud while reading it, or that I thought that what just happened could not possibly have actually just happened. Before I say any more though, I do need to clarify. I know I said no spoilers in the intro, and that's still true, but this section is definitely the closest I'm going to get to talking about spoilers, so if you're particularly sensitive and really want to avoid anything, maybe just skip this section. But yeah, we're going to be continuing on with the Game of Thrones comparison here for a second, because I have read all of the Game of Thrones novels that are out as of right now, and I did watch about half of the TV show, and I think that media's biggest strength was that it was, to me, so unpredictable. A lot of books will have main character status for its main characters, where you know that they're not going to be hurt too terribly, and they're certainly not going to die. But with Game of Thrones, they were not shy to have the worst possible things happen to their main characters, or even to kill some of them off entirely. Priory of the Orange Tree definitely does not have that, and definitely does still have some of that main character status at play. By the end of the novel, I had gotten so comfortable with the idea that there was at least going to be a relatively happy ending that the stakes did feel a little bit lowered. And that's not to criticize it, because I do think that most books kind of leave you with the impression that there is going to be some sort of happy ending. It's more just an observation that I made. There were some points during the novel that were a little bit more disappointingly predictable. I felt like Tane's whole character arc was especially expected, and then there were a few times that Ede did things that felt like they went directly against her personality but were completely necessary for the plotline to move forward, so like that was a little bit predictable in that sense. All in all though, when I say the predictability of Priory of the Orange Tree, I do mean it in a very minor way, and I more mean it as in the tone rather than the plotline. And it really isn't even a critique, because honestly, most of the novel, the stakes felt so unbelievably high that it was, in this case, kind of comforting to me to know that things were going to be at least moderately all right by the end. Now this book clocks in at around 800 pages. I know some of that is due to the formatting, but no one could argue that this is a short book, right? And in fact, the length was pretty much the sole reason that I was drawn to it in the first place. I have seen some critique of this book where people are saying that they don't know how a story can be so long and have so little happen. And again, if that's your viewpoint, that is fine. I promise this is not a personal attack against you. I just really don't understand that criticism at all. There are definitely long stretches of Priory of the Orange Tree where there's not intense action in the sense of fighting and battle scenes or an immediate deadline that people are racing against. I think a lot of the action is a little bit more subtle. So yeah, even though it wasn't always intense action, I feel like there was always something happening in the story, whether it was court drama or perilous journeys or dramatic irony or just this as of yet undefined and unpresent but ever looming threat. I genuinely felt like there was something going on that was worth paying attention to on every page. At no point during reading this novel did I feel like I was resting within the reading. I was literally on my toes the entire time. In fact, I almost have the opposite critique when it comes to the pace and the length of this book. I know this is wild to say about a story that, again, is 800 pages long, but I almost feel like it could have been longer. The first half of Priory of the Orange Tree is a lot of establishment and getting the reader used to the setting, but also the background lore and then all of the characters. There's just a lot of setup that happens, and it's really detailed, and it is very helpful to, like I said earlier, make it a little bit less overwhelming than it could have been. But the problem there is that the first half sets that up, and then the second half to like the last quarter of the book feels so rapid and so fast-paced in comparison. I feel like genuinely 90% of the actual intense action happened within the last 200 pages of the book. And especially the last couple of chapters where there's, the resolution to the whole story, they just felt so quick and so light in detail when compared to the beginning of the novel. So I'm not by any means saying that the story needed to be another 500 pages long, because I know it is already very long, but I do think an additional 1 or 2 chapters would have helped to serve as a bit of a buffer between the action sequences, and especially towards the end, I think that a couple of extra chapters would have made the ending feel more balanced with the beginning when it comes to the pacing. Given that this is a completely spoiler-free review, there's really not anything else I can say without getting too in-depth. Of course, I do want to end on just the fact that I really loved reading The Priory of the Orange Tree. The world was so interesting and so detailed. The characters were really lovable. The writing was beautiful. There were definitely times that I laughed out loud while reading, and also times that I cried while I was reading this book. And I feel like that's a great sign that reading something can elicit so much emotion. I feel like that's the mark of a good novel. Just because I had other things going on, it did take me a while to read this book, but when I was able to really dig into it, I was absolutely glued to the pages. If you're someone who likes to read queer romance stories, or just really detailed fantasy novels, or just long books in general, I definitely think that you will like this one. But yeah, that is going to be all of my thoughts on The Priory of the Orange Tree. Definitely let me know your feelings in the comments down below if you have read this book. I'd love to hear what you thought about it, what your favorite parts were, and all that jazz. And even if you haven't read it, I'd love to know how you feel about this review and whether this makes you want to read it. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day or your night or whatever it might be, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye guys!